The data mapping pattern is one that we use to keep track of data between different invocations of different workflows, and also where we're keeping track of IDs and data between one system and another. And it's a common pattern that we use when we're doing integrations between different systems. By way of example, what we're going to do is go through, picking up from where we left off in the do once pattern video. First of all, we're going to make a copy of this workflow, and we're going to call this a data mapping pattern. And if you remember from that video, what we did is we had data coming from a system such as Shopify. We want to take orders that are created from Shopify and move them over to a system. Let's say it was NetSuite, for instance, by example, an ERP system, in order to process that order. And we put in place the 8-kit nodes in order to prevent the same order from being actually sent through to the ERP system multiple times. And that's a great use case, and we're going to extend that a little bit more now. So before I do that, I'm just going to put a few sticky notes on here just to keep track of stuff. So I'm going to remind people that this is Shopify in our example. Actually, I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. And then what we had here was order number, I'm going to say 1000. So we're assuming here that we're making a call out to Shopify, and we get details from there about order number 1000. We check whether we've processed order with ID 1000. And then what we do is we send it over to something like, for instance, NetSuite. Okay, and that gets processed, and we say it's been successful and we're finished. But that's not the end of the story. What actually happens is something a little bit more interesting. So to represent that, I'm going to change this node. I'm going to change this back to a set. Okay, execute the previous steps. So I'm going to take the order ID that came out of Shopify here, and I'm going to see what actually happens when you actually send information through to a different system like an ERP. It will process that, and it will actually give you back the ID of the order, in this case at least, that it believes is the order ID for that particular piece of data. So in other words, Shopify thinks that the order is ID 1000 in this example, but your ERP order ID may come back as something completely separate. Now, they're not exactly the same piece of information. They are records in their own respective systems, and so they each have an ID for it. So in this case, our Shopify ID would be 1000, but then when we create that order and replicate that order in the ERP system, we get something completely different. And that's what typically happens when you're connecting with different systems. Each system has got its own ID for pieces of data that you're synchronizing and moving around. And that's fine. So let's just rename that. So that's like create order in ERP. So in this case, it's NetSuite. And what did we say? We said the order ID was this thing here. So let's just put that on the sticky note. So that is more representative of what happens in real life. If I zoom out slightly, what we end up doing here is still doing the do once. So we're only interested in never process the Shopify order more than once. So it's the Shopify ID that we use. And that's the end of the story, and that's finished. However, it's not quite the end of the story. Again, what we end up doing is, for instance, wanting to have shipping updates maybe coming back from NetSuite back to Shopify. So the direction of travel now moves away from Shopify to NetSuite, and from NetSuite to Shopify. And the reason I put these sticky notes here is to represent almost like a left to right relationship. So on the left, we have Shopify. On the right, we have NetSuite. So why is that important? Well, that's because we've kind of mapped this out based on the way that we draw out and represent our workflows in tools like N8N. So what I will do now is I will go over to 8-kit, And for our next step, I'm going to create a lookup. Now, I'm going to keep an ID. I want to keep track of those different IDs between the systems. So I'm going to create a new lookup, and I'm going to call it orders. On the left, we have Shopify. On the right, let's say we have NetSuite. This is almost for documentation purposes, making sure that we keep things in sync. It's not for anything else, but it's a great way of almost self-documenting the relationship between data and so on. So what we have here as well is a more advanced use of the lookups. We can have one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many type relationships, and 8-Kit will try and be strict about those sorts of relationships if you need them. If you don't need them and you don't worry about them, just ignore this and leave the defaults. So we now have an orders. And what I want to do now is, now that I've got the orders lookup set up, I'm going to go back to NA10 and I'm going to keep track of those different orders as they go through the system. So last time we ran this, we had order ID 1000 and so on. Then what we would do is say we've actually processed that order, and I'm going to add an extra node now. That's another 8-Kit node. This is where we actually store that mapping. I'm going to add the mapping to the collection name as orders. We just created that. On the left, we have the Shopify ID. In this case, it's this one. And on the right, we have the ERP order ID. On the right hand side there. If I execute that step, it records that information really quickly inside 8-Kit. And if I go back to 8-Kit, I can see now that in here we have a new lookup value, which is 1000, represents this in NetSuite. And that's how we keep track of the IDs between different systems. So going back to our example again, what we want to do now is send information back from NetSuite back to Shopify. So how do we do that? Well, let's represent this. This would be done on a separate workflow, but for purposes of this this video, I'm just going to put it on the same one just for fun. So I'm going to add a node. I'm going to do exactly the same in the opposite direction. I'm going to say get shipping update from the ERP. And the ERP order ID, let's call it ERP order ID, is, yes, I've still got it in the buffer. What we have here is the ERP order ID. So we've got a shipping update. What we have to do now is then go and look up the Shopify ID for that same ERP ID, because Shopify doesn't know anything about the ID inside the ERP. So let's do that now. So let's have an 8-Kit lookup. And we're doing a lookup, and we are going to search for a lookup value. We're going to search inside orders, and we're going to search from the right hand side. If you remember, right is the ERP in our example here, and we're looking for the value that we got from here. So I'm just going to map that down there so that I can just execute the step. The ERP order ID is there. Then I can drag that into the lookup. And what happens is it will go and look for that particular item, and it will say, here it is, you've got the ID 1000 that comes back, and that's the Shopify ID in our example. Then I can go off and do a update Shopify with shipping update. But what I can do is I can actually use the Shopify ID instead of the ERP ID, in order to effectively go and execute that. And that's how we handle and manage mapping IDs between different systems. So when something's created, we add a mapping so we don't forget it. And then we want to use it again, we come back through and we look that up as if we were in the same workflow. And that's how we handle those things. Now, obviously, in a real scenario, we'd also do a do once pattern over this as well, and so on, so that we only ever process the same shipping update once. But for the purposes of this video, we're here to talk about the data mapping pattern, and that's what we've done. And so now you've got, in our example, orders being created and shipping updates coming back through to Shopify as well. And it's as simple as that.